got there, but we saw a crash of one of the flying saucers. And he said one of them was still alive, and it was walking around. And he said there were two other bodies, but they were in body bags, so he really couldn't see them.
Before there were headlines about Roswell, there was a nurse, a hangar, and a journal nobody opened for 27 years. Margaret Ellen Reyes wrote down, in plain and steady handwriting, what she says she witnessed inside a restricted hangar in July 1947. A dying creature with gray skin and black eyes that held her hand like it had been waiting for her. Here's her account, word for word. The date was July 8, 1947. By her own reckoning, it was around 2 in the morning, though she admits her watch had stopped working. She couldn't say exactly when, only that it had, and from that moment on, everything about time felt broken. Her words, not mine. She'd been summoned to a locked hangar at Roswell Army Airfield under conditions she calls unusual. No paperwork, no formal meeting. A man wearing a uniform she couldn't place, not standard Air Force, not standard Army, somewhere in between, knocked on her door and told her she was needed. She asked why. He answered only that there were wounded. She went. And this is where her story stops matching anything in the public record and turns into something else entirely. The hangar, she wrote, had been split up using canvas dividers. Harsh lights hung overhead. Surgical lights, she noted specifically, the kind used in operating rooms, set above 3 separate areas. She mentions a strange odor she couldn't identify. Not disinfectant, not blood. Something metallic, she says, like copper mixed with rainfall. Moving through the dividers, she first came upon what looked like severely burned people. Small, pale, with proportions that struck her as wrong somehow. Heads too large for their bodies, limbs too long. At first she blamed the dim lighting, the shock of being pulled from sleep at 2 a.m. She kept walking. That's where the story becomes impossible to shrug off. Past a heavier canvas wall, reinforced with what looked like metal supports, she came across something she called, plainly, not human. She wrote that line without any drama, in the same steady handwriting she used to describe the weather or her dinner. Not human. 4 words. The calmest 4 words in the whole journal. It stood roughly 4 feet tall. Its skin, gray. Not pale, not white, but the gray of dead ash or a clouded sky. Its head was oversized and smooth. Its eyes were open, solid black, no pupil, no white visible anywhere. And still, she stresses this, she felt looked at, seen completely, in a way she had no words for. It was barely breathing. She took its hand, she wrote, because that's what she'd do for any patient who was scared, dying, and alone. She was a nurse. That's the job. Here's the line that stays with me. I've read it more times than I can count. Its fingers closed around mine with something I can only call recognition, as if it had been waiting for exactly this. Not for treatment, not for medicine, for someone to stay. She remained there roughly 40 minutes, by her guess, though she again notes that time in that room felt unreliable. Eventually its grip went slack. The eyes stayed open. I believe it passed. I don't know where it passed to. Then the stranger in the unfamiliar uniform appeared at her side and walked her out. Now, the doubter in me has to speak up. A handwritten journal, a nurse long dead, a story that only came to light 27 years after it supposedly happened, turning up in a box at an estate sale in Albuquerque in spring 1974, bought for 60 cents by a retired teacher, Dorothy Class, as part of a bundle of random paperwork. Follow the trail with me. Reyes writes the entries in 1947. It presumably stays in her possession until her death in late 1973. Her estate gets cleared out fast, unusually fast, some say, within 4 months, and the journal ends up as an unmarked item in an unmarked box. Class buys it having no idea what's inside. It sits untouched in a garage in Flagstaff for 25 years. A researcher named Philip Oates stumbles on a passing mention of it in an obscure New Mexico history newsletter in 1999, tracks down Class's nephew Harold, and in 2001 photographs all 43 pages, sharing copies with a handful of fellow researchers. 2 years later, Oates dies of a heart attack. He's 51. I'm not claiming that means anything by itself. I'm pointing out that every single person who ever physically held that original journal is now gone. The journal itself hasn't surfaced since 2003. When 2 different researchers reached Harold Klass in 2008 and again in 2011, he'd only say the journal was no longer his to give and wouldn't say more. He died in 2016. The photographs, 43 pages on 35mm film, developed at a shop in Tucson, went to 4 people. 2 of them can't be found anywhere after roughly 2005. A third handed her copies to a friend before losing her own set in a house fire in Portland in 2009. The 4th and final complete set, the only one believed to still exist, is a second-generation photocopy owned by a retired archivist in Santa Fe who has turned down every request to see it. Once you trace that path, it's hard to unsee it. No agency has ever confirmed this journal exists, not the Air Force, not the National Archives, not the historical office tied to Roswell Army Airfield. As far as any institution is concerned, Margaret Ellen Reyes and her journal simply don't exist. Her name shows up in 0 declassified personnel files from that period. And that absence starts to feel like proof of something. Roswell Army Airfield in 1947 had, by various declassified counts, somewhere around 200 to 400 support staff, medical personnel included. Over the years, researchers combing through document releases from 1979 through 2011 have named nurses, orderlies, doctors, and aides working there at the time. Margaret Ellen Reyes is in none of it. Not as staff, not as a contractor, not in any role whatsoever. So was she never actually there? Or was she there in a way somebody made sure got scrubbed? I want to circle back to the hangar because I think we've rushed past it. Reyes was a working medical professional. Whatever she believed personally, whatever era she lived in, she was trained to watch closely, take note, and record accurately. And the physical details she wrote down are hard to explain away as panic or imagination. She notes it had no visible ears, just small indentations on either side of the skull, roughly where ears would sit, 4 fingers per hand, not 5, longer than a person's, tapering to rounded tips instead of square ones, a minimal nose, just 2 narrow slits rather than a raised bridge, a mouth that was a thin, straight line she never once saw open. There's something else she describes, something I've reread trying to find another way to read it. Holding its hand, she became aware of what she calls a pressure, not physical, not painful, but a sense of information pressing into her, being passed to her or planted in her mind, skipping language entirely. She describes suddenly knowing a kind of cold, deep, vast, dimensional cold, unlike anything she'd felt before. She writes, "I felt briefly that I understood where it had come from, not a place, a distance. I'm a skeptic by trade. I don't take testimony like this and run with it blindly. But the particular texture of her writing, the way she reaches for words that don't quite fit, the way she openly admits the limits of what she can describe, carries a kind of honesty that made-up stories rarely bother including. Fabricated accounts tend to be tidier, more finished. They don't usually have the narrator confessing she doesn't understand what happened to her." Then comes the most remarkable part. She asks it a question. She has no idea if it can hear, no idea if language means anything to it at all. But she's holding its hand as it dies, and she asks, "Where do you come from?" She writes that the answer arrived not as sound or sight, but as a feeling in her chest, like a held breath finally let go, and the word, or the impression, the closest thing to a word, that surfaced, she wrote down, then crossed out. Still readable in Oates's photographs, Pleiades, crossed out. Beside it, not a word, a feeling like that word. I don't know if I chose it or if it was given to me. I don't know either. But that word sat in a journal written in 1947 by a woman with no obvious reason to invent it. Crossed out, as though even she wasn't sure she should claim it. Margaret Reyes isn't a one-off case. That's the part that changes everything once you zoom out far enough. I've spent considerable time collecting other stories that follow a very particular shape. Medical staff, mostly nurses, with some documented or rumored connection to Roswell in the summer of 1947, who then quietly vanish from official paperwork. No drama, no announcement, they just stop showing up. There's a woman referred to only by the initials EM in a 1952 letter kept in a private collection in Silver City, New Mexico, described by the letter's writer as a co-worker from the base who can't talk about what she tended to that July. EM is never mentioned again in any letter from that collection. There's a line buried in a declassified internal memo from 1949, loosely tied to staff reassignments in the Southwest, referencing personnel with specialized trauma exposure requiring reassignment to non-clinical roles. It doesn't name a single person. It doesn't specify what kind of trauma. It affects, by its own count, 14 people. 14 medical staff pulled from clinical work in the Southwest 2 years after Roswell, with no record of what they'd been exposed to. It's a quiet pattern. It doesn't call attention to itself. But once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it. Someone witnesses something, writes it down, disappears from the record, the documentation scatters and decays, and what's left behind is the barest outline of something huge that we're never quite permitted to see head-on. Why nurses, specifically? I've put that question to everyone I could find who studies this material seriously. The best answer I've come across is also the plainest. Nurses are the ones in the room when a person is dying, not doctors, who diagnose, treat, and move on to the next patient. Nurses stay. If you needed a witness to a death that wasn't human, professionally speaking, a nurse is exactly who you'd end up with. And a nurse who sat holding a hand for 40 minutes would know things a doctor with 4 minutes and a scalpel never would. The temperature of the skin, whether there was a pulse, and what it felt like, whether the breathing had any rhythm, and the moment it stopped. She'd know if something reached back. The journal doesn't end with the creature's death. Reyes made 6 more entries over roughly the following 8 days. They're shorter, tighter, as if she knew on some level she shouldn't be writing any of it and wrote it anyway before she lost her nerve. In the first entry after the encounter, she notes she'd been reassigned, not to a new base, not a new unit, but to desk work at the same facility, processing supply orders, a trained surgical nurse, counting inventory. By the third entry, she writes that 2 men came to question her. She never describes them beyond calling them official-looking, and says their questions weren't really questions. They were statements dressed up as questions. They weren't asking what I saw. They were telling me what I'd seen and watching to see if I'd agree. She doesn't record what she told them, only, I gave them the answer they seemed to want. 6 days after the encounter, she writes something that has stuck with me permanently. I know this will sound like I've lost my mind. I haven't. I've never been more aware of my own mind than I am now. That's the problem. I can't unknow what I know. I can only choose what to do with the knowing. The last entry is 3 sentences. I am being transferred. No destination given. I leave Wednesday. Then nothing. The journal stops. As far as any surviving record shows, Margaret Reyes disappears from documented life that summer, briefly resurfaces in a 1963 census in Albuquerque, and dies in late 1973 with no military record, no pension file, no official trace of ever having worked at Roswell Army Airfield. 26 years unaccounted for. 26 years between a Wednesday departure and a cardboard box at an estate sale. What filled those years? Where was she sent? Did she ever talk about what she'd seen? Did she ever find the words for that pressure in her chest, for the cold that wasn't cold, for the gray hand that gripped hers in recognition and then went still? We don't know. What's left is 43 pages and a name that leads nowhere anyone's willing to open a door to. And those pages exist as a single set of photographs nobody will share. Out of everything, one detail keeps pulling me back. Not the physical details of its body, not the missing paperwork, not the 14 reassigned nurses, or the crossed-out word, or the photographs locked away in Santa Fe. Not even the long trail of coincidences. Too many, too convenient, too perfectly aligned with the idea that none of it actually happened. I keep coming back to the gesture. She reached for its hand, and it held on. What does that tell us? about whatever that being was, wherever it had traveled from, however it got here, however badly that journey ended. It was dying inside a military hangar on a world that wasn't its own, surrounded by people who couldn't understand a word of what it was, and who, within days, would make sure its existence was scrubbed from every record they could reach. And in that moment, one person reached back, and it held on. Isn't that, no matter what else is true, a story about not dying alone, about being seen, and if we entertain, even just for a moment, that this really happened, that a non-human intelligence lay dying in the New Mexico desert in July 1947, and that its final experience of this planet was one woman's hand, staying, then what does it say about all of us that we spent the following 70-plus years acting like it never occurred? What knowledge died in that hangar? What was carried inside that creature? Languages, histories, an understanding of physics, of consciousness, of time, that we don't even have a framework to imagine, that simply ended while a nurse held its hand and a man in an unmarked uniform stood a few feet away. We don't ask that question often enough. We get pulled into whether it's real, into the paper trail, the handwriting checks, the personnel files. We argue chain of custody and forget to ask what we actually lost. If Margaret Reyes's account is true, and I'm not telling you it is, I'm only asking you to sit with what it would mean if it were, then somewhere between that 40-minute encounter and a cardboard box in Albuquerque, a thread of knowledge touched two entirely different kinds of mind, and then it broke. Gone. Never recovered. Not classified, not hidden by decree, just lost, the way anything is lost when the only witness decides, or is made to decide, to carry it alone. She held its hand. It knew her. Something passed between them she spent the rest of her life unable to fully explain, written into a leather journal almost nobody read, that now exists only as a photograph in a room no one will unlock. What was inside that pressure she felt? What was inside the cold that wasn't cold? What was that word that wasn't quite Pleiades? Something enormous happened in that hangar, something two very different kinds of minds, briefly, imperfectly, but undeniably shared. And whatever it was, the quiet around it has now lasted 79 years.